Time to begin. I know people are going to be filtering in. People are going to be filtering in from the lunch downstairs. Hope everyone enjoyed that lunch. Hope you enjoyed the earlier meeting. I offer that under my hat as the co-chair of this entire event. Lewis Shephard, I'm the chair of the AFCEA Intelligence Committee, which with INSA puts this two-day annual event on, the Intelligence and National Security Summit. Thank you for attending. This panel is the one that I've been looking forward to the most, and I'm merely the moderator, but I'm delighted to feature what I believe may wind up being the single most topical and future relevant panel discussion of this event, Pacific partnerships and the lessons of NATO and Ukraine. I'm going to do a very quick lightning introduction of everybody, and then we're going to get into the content. From this end of the panel going down in alphabetical order, Charles Edel, Senior Advisor and Australia Chair at CSIS, has also been a Naval War College Professor of Strategy and Policy, has served on the State Department Policy Planning staff. Colleen Kalina, who is the Chief of Partner Mission Integration at the Directorate for Global Integration at DIA, generally acknowledged to be the world's finest intelligence organization. DIA, my alma mater. Hi, thank you.
That was for DIA.
That's for Colleen, not for DIA. Rear Admiral Axel Ristal, Defense and Naval Attaché, Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany, a longtime leader in German defense intelligence and its Ministry of Defense. Next to him, Chad Sabragia, China Indo-Pacific Focus Research Analyst at IDA, Institute for Defense Analyses, and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for China. Before that, Director of the U.S. Marine Corps China Research Group. And at the end there, Andrew Winternitz, Principal Director for Europe and NATO Policy, Office of the Secretary of Defense. He's also, by the way, previously acted as the Principal Director for East Asia. So I think you see a theme here of NATO and Europe and the Pacific. So we're going to begin right here with Mr. Edel. Can you help the audience contextualize NATO's Pacific partnerships as they stand through a Ukraine lens? How has this current European crisis influenced the Pacific partners' domestic conversations, their national security strategy lenses, resource allocations, et cetera? Set the stage for us, Charles.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks very much for the invitation to join you in this terrific panel that we have here. Let me, at the outset, much more narrowly scope that question, because the Indo-Pacific, nay, the Asia-Pacific, nay, Asia, is a very big place. So we're actually going to talk just about 4 nations and the ones who are just at Vilnius: Japan, Australia, South Korea, and New Zealand. And I thought I might approach your question by talking about how Ukraine has filtered through each of those countries' domestic politics and their strategic planning, why that is occurring, and then stepping back a little bit for what this might portend for the future. So when we look at this, I named those 4 countries. They were in Madrid for the first time as a group, AP4. They've now switched acronyms. Andrew, IP4?
IPP.
IPP, I can't even keep up myself. They were in Vilnius this week, and the inclusion was undertaken because those 4 countries have played a very large, in some ways leading role on contributing to the defense of Ukraine. They've depicted Russia's invasion of Ukraine as intimately tied to their own security, and they have noted their willingness to join a global coalition. And they've thought about and prompted the conversation, I think, about what would happen if a similar situation occurs much closer to their own shores. So let me just run through each of those 4 countries quickly. Japan has really led the way here. I don't think that's much of a surprise. Prime Minister Kishida leading on the sanctions, traveling around the world. But he has said over and over again that we are doing this for Europe, but also because what happens in Europe might occur in East Asia tomorrow. You can see this Ukraine kind of moving through the Japanese domestic system. Before the invasion of Ukraine, I think polling was about 20% or so supporting big defense increases. Now, when we fast forward a year and a half plus in, it's hovering around 65%, and that's allowed the LDP to do what I would argue they've wanted to do for a long time. You've seen this with the national security strategy that they put out in December. You've seen this with a doubling of their budget. You've seen this with a transformation of their defense posture across the southern islands, obviously complicating what might be a move by China towards Taiwan. Similar situation has occurred in Australia, although it's somewhat different. Prime Minister Albanese, the new prime minister, the old prime minister was there before, said that the reason that they are supporting Ukraine, which is very far away from Australia, he adds that line every single time, is because we support the rule of law, we support international order, and we want to make sure that such incidents like this cannot stand. Richard Marles, who's the defense minister, underscored that even more, noting that we want to make sure that anything like this cannot stand again. And this happens in the midst of a much larger defense transformation in Australia, which we saw starting in 2020, but really accelerating this past year, not only with the announcement of the way forward for AUKUS, but the release of the Australian Defense Strategic Review in April, and then beginning of putting their budget forward to move this, no less with some of the defense posture changes in North Australia that we're beginning to see. Interestingly, in South Korea, President Yoon has said that we see that freedom and authoritarianism are clashing once again, and he explicitly referenced the Korean War and noted that during the Korean War we saw the world's democracies rallying to the support of South Korea. That's what we are trying to undertake right now. You've seen a plus up in the defense budget from South Korea, and very interestingly, clearly from Seoul's point of view, this is allowing them an opportunity to begin exporting munitions, exporting arms, growing their defense industrial base in a way that they hadn't before, and finding new customers around the world. New Zealand probably lagging a little bit further behind those, but Prime Minister Chris Hipkins noted that this is really important for New Zealand. He was over there too, and I will note that New Zealand is in the midst of changing some of their strategic documents. They've just put out their first one in July, noting that they are seeing and noting because of Ukraine, amongst other things, other things always means China in this context, the revival of the need to have increased defense spending for themselves. So look, when you take those four countries together, when you zoom out together, I would simply say that the invasion of Ukraine has injected more urgency into the defense planning of all these countries. It's prompted each one of those countries to look for more partnerships amongst each other, with others, and with NATO countries, and it's made them aware of resource shortages that they have, and underscored quite obviously that they are living, we are all living, in a much more brittle and dangerous world. Now, why are they undertaking this besides the obvious? I would say first, this is being done, as they say repeatedly and explicitly, in the name of global stability. That's why they are willing to pay more than they had in the past. It's being done for European security. It's being done in defense of the UN Charter. It's being done in hopes of deterring Beijing from undertaking a similar action, first and foremost across the Taiwan Straits, but also, I think, very clearly, if oftentimes implicitly, it's being done by showing how much they are doing for the security and stability of Europe, and with the implicit question being asked of NATO, in a similar situation, what would you be willing to do in reverse? Before leaving, I would just note, scoping out much larger than what's happening right now, I think we have the beginnings of a really interesting conversation going on, not only on the day-to-day, but also strategically. Because if nothing else, what we've seen in Ukraine, what the United States has led with its allies and partners and with NATO's, is the onset of a new type of coalition that's behaved very creatively and very quickly under quite dire circumstances. And when we think about this, we can think about the template of coalition building and begin to think about what sharpening it and applying it to other geographies might look like. I won't get into these now, but I would just say that we could all probably list a lot of things that have been done very creatively. Everything from the dissemination of intelligence, we can read your playbook quicker than you can make moves, to coming up with coordinated economic sanctions. Again, easier to do inside the structures of an entity like NATO than it is for a grouping that doesn't really exist with institutions. Stockpiling certain critical resources, making sure that frontline states have weapons before the firing starts. Shoring up the flanks of NATO has clear applicability in the Indo-Pacific region, although the geography looks quite different there as well. And then finally, which I hear all the time in the context of AUKUS, of course, is we've seen just how quickly we can move on making sure that technology transfer is there when we need it to be there. That is something that is clearly important for the Asia-Pacific, very important for AUKUS, but our systems have not yet quite caught up to where we are on this. So I would simply conclude with this, saying that, look, some of these actions that we saw in Ukraine were taken in advance because of the structures of what we have. Some were taken in extremis and done quite creatively and on the fly. Things that we can take in advance of a conflict obviously have the potential for deterring them. Things that we take action after the shooting has started are a totally different set of circumstances.
Fascinating. All right, thanks everybody. That actually tees up beautifully. Next, Colleen, so your directorate, the Directorate for Global Integration, it's, if I'm not mistaken, the newest at the Defense Intelligence Agency. It may be the newest major directorate in the IC. Global integration, that sounds entirely relevant to that full sheet of music that Charlie was just describing. How do you, from your government perch, how do you see this issue and think of it strategically from that global integration standpoint, Europe, Pacific?
So thank you for that question, and I will say that the Directorate for Global Integration as a concept, as an integrated factor, function, office, is actually the sort of thing that we need in a global context, which we lack in the Pacific, right? So NATO has been able to serve some of those purposes for the response to Russian aggression in Ukraine. From DIA's perspective, and for those of you that don't know, we have Admiral Jacoby sitting right here in the audience, and thank you very much, sir. My first introduction to partnership was working as our DIA liaison officer in Ottawa with our incredibly great partners across the globe, but also in North American defense. And Admiral Jacoby gave me that opportunity and told me what to do on a daily basis. So it was very instructive. But so back to the idea of integration. You know, one of the reasons that we were successful, or have been successful thus far, in combating Russian aggression in Ukraine, is this idea that, you know, that we had integrated platforms and structures and common ways of thinking already in place in Europe. So, you know, and Charlie mentioned the respect for the rule of law, the respect for national sovereignty, the idea that binds us all together, in some cases as democratic governments, but in all cases, in respect for human rights and, you know, and self-determination, and the things that we are seeing are counter to the Russian plan. Those pre-existed the aggression there. That's part and parcel of our partnership with our European allies. That's not necessarily true in all aspects of our Pacific partnerships. There are nations that still exist that are looking at, you know, a Chinese incursion into Taiwan or other destabilizing efforts in the Pacific as somewhat inevitable. possibly something that doesn't necessarily affect their national interests. We have a lot of work to do in establishing the very first part of integration and partnership, which is coming to a common understanding of what our goal is. And I think that what NATO has done so brilliantly in the last few years is initiate these out-of-the-box partnerships with the Australians, with the Japanese, with the Kiwis, with the Koreans, to change that dialectic and to change that dialogue so that we're looking at what does integrated global security look like? Because there is no longer, especially from the United States perspective, an opportunity to address problems that are solely regional or solely continental. And what we are looking at in terms of stability across the Pacific requires all of us to think differently, and we're thinking differently, not just in the warfighting mode, but we're thinking differently in how our economies are intertwined, how we respond to all of the scenarios that impact our national security and our ability to act in a rules-based order in that region. And I think that part of the outreach that NATO has done has helped us to start that conversation. We have a series of bilateral partnerships that all of our nations have in the Pacific. Changing that to a multilateral environment sets the stage for coalition warfare when it's required, but coalition response when warfare is not required. And so those multilateral partnerships, the more that we do to establish first of all, a common set of goals in the region, but then a ability to interact not in a bilateral sense, but in a multilateral response, is hugely important. And you're going to hear from Axel in a minute about where Germany is going. Part of that is starting the national conversation about what your security strategy is in the region, and then using that to identify where we have overlapping interests. There are things in the Ukrainian context that went extremely well, and Charlie already spoke to a lot of those. There are other things that were enabled not necessarily by the immediacy of the threat, but by the sufficiency and the thoroughness of the planning in advance. So, we have systems that speak to each other from an IT perspective. We have spent many years making sure that from a combat perspective we're interoperable. And we're not in combat in the Ukraine, but we are supporting the Ukrainians in a way that requires us to understand how those weapon systems interface and how they work together, and what makes sense in terms of what could or could not be fielded and where support should or should not be sought. And so, none of these things are necessarily in place in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific region at this point in time. So we need to think hard about, how do we structure ourselves to interact. From an intelligence standpoint, that means speed. And again, Charlie spoke to our ability to get in front of an aggressor's actions before they can take them. That is all absolutely dependent on our ability to communicate with the partner that can take the action, to ensure that either that information is out there and we're using intelligence in brand new ways, in informing the international public about what's happening in Ukraine, or to actually take some sort of action from an economic, political, or military perspective. And in order to do that, we have to be able to share that information effectively and quickly. So we need to rethink what our IT infrastructure is. We need to be building that. It cannot simply be a conversation where we invite people to a summit, but it actually has to be concrete action steps that we take to build the coalition environment that will allow us to exchange information. And that is, at this point, not as robust in the Pacific theater as it might be. Some of the other things that we need to be thinking about are that if we are intent on pushing back aggression in that region, then interoperability amongst our forces is key in a different way than what's going on in the Ukrainian theater right now. That requires us to think big thoughts about how do we classify information. Right now, most of our countries classify information based on the sources and methods that are used to obtain that information. With the advent of AI and the ubiquity of open source data that can help to change the combat environment, we need to be thinking about whether or not our classification should be outcome dependent rather than sources and methods dependent. And the levels of classification may need to shift to support coalition warfare in a different way than they do now. Right now, obviously, we classify based on the amount of harm that could be caused to our government if the information becomes known. Maybe we need to change that conversation to classification based on the amount of harm that would happen if we're not able to share that information, because the outcome is no longer a single national outcome. The outcome is now an international and global outcome, and whatever happens, in the Pacific has implications and ramifications for all of us. So, those are just some thoughts about maybe, the underlying structures that need to be in place that are bound by a common purpose, but actually executed in common goals and objectives that each of us as partners can take on.
That's a good point at which to put ourselves in the shoes of a non-U.S. viewpoint. Talking about what Colleen mentioned as this global integrated construct that's lacking in Asia, and thinking about potential current and differently potential partners in Asia, how they come to the decision to actually participate in these multilateral arrangements. And Germany is one of the best historical cases of looking at that, current and historical partner with the United States for decades. Admiral, what's the construct that would be relevant for Pacific viewpoints from Germany's standpoint?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to the audience and having this wonderful discussion. And you mentioned the word historic. So if you allow, I would have a small glance on our historical situation in Germany after the Second World War and how we found our way into the multilateral systems where we are engaged today. So the situation after the Second World War was, in simple words, in Germany as follows. Germany, until May 1949, there was not really a Germany. Let's put it this way, the Germans in the British, French, and United States zone had an interest to survive economically. They were simply busy with managing their day. And I remember very well a conversation with my grandma. It will be a short story. With my grandma in the 80s, and I asked her, Grandma, what was your worst ever winter? And she was an old woman at that time, and I expected something like 1944 to 45, the winter, or maybe the winter 1945 to 46. And she answered to me, my worst winter, Little Axel, which is my first name, my worst winter was 1946 and 47. Two thoughts. I wasn't aware that this devastating situation in Germany was so long. I somehow, at that time in the 80s, had in my mind that we recovered relatively quickly in Germany, which we did, but it took some time. And the second point is I had to look it up, and if you Google it, you end up in the expression of hunger winter or Hungerwinter, for those of you who speak German, with a really tough winter of minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit in many parts of the countries. So it was very tough. But coming back to the point, the ordinary German in the 40s was busy to manage his life. The other European countries, of course, they had also issues, but the former enemies of the Nazis were, of course, interested in a security organization, also mainly in order to control the Germans. And having said that, it is not surprising that the European coal and steel community, or how we called it, Montanunion, was established in April 1951, and Germany was a founding member, besides 5 others, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Italy, and France. And this treaty basically placed the steel and coal production of the 6 founding states under the control of a supranational authority. The main objective of the treaty was the mutual control of coal and steel, which were essential war materials, and to safeguard these production factors, which were crucial for reconstruction after World War II. And I found it very interesting that the first real multilateral alliance where the German was a member was security orientated, but not at the first place. It was an economical system. What about the security domain? Well, at the end of the World War II, the rearmament of Germany and its integration into European security policy had been heavily discussed by the Western allies and among the Germans itself as well. Many Germans thought that a rearmament could endanger a possible reunification with East Germany. And I think that was a valid point. It was now the charismatic first German Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, who decided, well, the Western integration is more important than a possible quick German reunification, end of quote. With that, he basically sacrificed any potential for a short-term reunification with East Germany, and it took another 40 years. While this discussion happened, NATO was founded in April 1949, and the West German state was founded 1 month later in May 1949. So the security environment in the world after World War II was as follows. In 1945 to 1949, we saw the Chinese Communist Revolution. 1948, the Communist Party assumed control over the Czechoslovakia through a coup d'etat. In 1948, we saw the Berlin blockade, where the Soviet Union blocked the Western Alliance on railroad, road, and canal access to the sectors of Berlin, which were under Western control. And in 1950, we saw the North Korean invaded South Korea. So after some conferences, also in London, also in Paris, finally West Germany was allowed to rearm militarily and join NATO as the 15th member in 1955 in May. And the young West German nation was from then on part of the Western security system. And then this was basically the first pure security alliance for us Germans, 10 years after the World War II. The treaties were disputed in West Germany and in other countries as well due to fears of a resurgence of German militarism. They were certainly there. Many opponents feared an escalation of the East-West conflict and rejected rearmament in view of the unresolved German question. In his memories, the already mentioned German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer stated that the idea of wanting to make a defense contribution in Europe was very unpopular among the German people at that time. Well, a nightmare situation would have been if the Western Germany would again divide into 2 countries. So we are grateful, looking back, to have a charismatic leader who kept the group together and the society. Nevertheless, it was, of course, the very best and right decision, as we all know today. And coming to an end, looking back, the following main factors were decisive, absolutely decisive, when it came to the question what made it possible for Germany to join NATO. So number one, we had an increasingly tense security situation in Europe after World War II. This was the stomach feeling of everybody. The recognition, this is number 2, the recognition that communism was spreading out in the world, not even in Europe. Number 3, there was a charismatic leader in Germany who prioritized Western integrations instead of striving for a possible quick reunification. And number 4, we had a strong transatlantic link to the United States and Canada, and they were able to provide credible security guarantees. So the history is telling us today that NATO survived the Warsaw Pact, which was dissolved in 1991. And today, 68 years after joining NATO, a united Germany remains firmly embedded in NATO with its currently 31 member states. And therefore, we are very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That brings up the necessity of really thinking specifically about military calculus in the balance of power in the Pacific, and it's the lessons learned from thinking about the role of military added to economic and other domains in Europe. So, Chad, what's the military dynamic? Our national defense strategy talks about integrated deterrence. What's the military role within deterrence in the Pacific, in this globally integrated set of partnerships across the Pacific? What affects China's mindset? What shapes its calculus?
I have it all right here in my pocket, and so I'm going to share it afterwards. It's a great question. First, like the other panelists, I have to thank AFCEA International and INSA for really putting on a tremendous event, and really applaud the topic and certainly the fellow panelists here today. So I hope to try to kind of provide a little bit of contrast, right, which is to turn that map around and really look at NATO and this outreach into the Indo-Pacific through China's lens, with the aim to kind of illuminate what their calculus is, as the question was asked, and maybe help us kind of think about what maybe we should be thinking about writ large. The easy part here, which is a little bit unusual for a lot of China watchers, is that China actually talks about NATO quite a bit. And this is exemplified very fortuitously by the party's byline earlier this week, in one of their propaganda articles that was entitled, NATO's Black Hand Reaches Out to the Asia Pacific to Expose Its Ugly Intentions, unquote. That kind of tells you everything that I think you might need to know. So, after the summit, so on the backside, in the wake of the NATO summit here this week, China's foreign ministry characterized the NATO communique as a complete opposite of the truth and the product of a Cold War mentality and ideological basis or bias. Beijing underscored this strong opposition to NATO's position and claims that more than 30 years after the Cold War ended, NATO remains trapped in a zero-sum mindset and views the world as opposing blocks, and that despite the global community's call for peace, development, and common progress, NATO continues to act against the prevailing trend and seeks to turn back the wheel of history, and closes by claiming that the world will not welcome this. Well, certainly China does not welcome NATO into the Indo-Pacific. So that's kind of that's where we're at now. But so the more important kind of question, I think, is, so how did we get here, and kind of what does that mean for the future? So I'll pivot off the same kind of starting point that many others have, which is this Russian invasion of Ukraine really was kind of a turning point here. First, because it really illuminated a really severe contradiction that had already resided in China's considerations for national security, national decision-making. But with the invasion, this contradiction kind of came to light. On one hand, Russia's invasion really kind of tested Beijing's respect of Moscow's interest, which really is a foundational principle for mutual trust between two nations, at least in China's formula. If Beijing failed to support Russia, Moscow would not only strip the reciprocal deference to China's core interests, which would hurt, but the worst condition was that it could ultimately kind of shatter this bilateral strategic partnership that has developed over decades, which both nations view as really central to their own long-term agendas. This includes really prominently the shared interest in reformation of the international order. So as reform of the order for China is to achieve its own long-term goals, a broken Sino-Russia relationship here is really a significant problem for Beijing, and that helps understand kind of why China's, what you've seen from China in the ongoing conflict. But on the other hand, this war is generating very broad global instability that's utterly inconsistent with the maintenance of a peaceful international environment, which is an abiding national priority for China to achieve its mid-century goals. Left unchecked, this conflict could, in China's view, escalate and spawn further instability and amplify perceptions of China as a systemic threat that intensifies strategic rivalries, could constrain Beijing's agenda, stunt its continued development and development of national power, and frankly just kind of exhaust its economic, political, diplomatic, and military capital necessary for China to achieve its own revival. As Beijing kind of views security and development as kind of codependent priorities, faltering in either is both a material and kind of conceptual disadvantage to it pretty significantly. This is why Moscow's invasion is utterly maddening for Beijing, and explains really kind of how NATO and NATO's recent activities bears on China's long-term aspirations. The most prominent is really that Moscow's kind of inconceivable irrationality, and I think Beijing thinks of it that way too, makes the threat of Beijing's use of force, particularly in a cross-strait scenario, but others, no longer hypothetical, but altogether conceivable, which is really kind of the opposite trend line of what Beijing has largely successfully aimed at for several decades now. Beijing now has to scramble to avert Moscow's attack from inspiring increased skepticism of China's own long-term intentions, generating greater global vigilance to contest China's coercive activities, and exercising long atrophied muscles of kind of Western security collaboration at a great power scale. And that's what they're seeing, right? Yet Beijing concludes that the current is really kind of now really overwhelmingly negative for it, and NATO's focus is a prominent example of this trend line. That's how they see this. One of the first events in the wake of Russia's invasion, remember, was NATO actually came out with comments to talk about its activities and orientation into the Indo-Pacific, which I think from Beijing's point of view must have been just utterly unhelpful. And then we started to draw in Asian nations. We started to direct, NATO started to direct greater attention beyond Europe. And importantly, like the EU had done previously, NATO characterized China as a systemic challenge. Those are important words for the party. The party calls this NATO's Asia-Pacification and rejects it along multiple lines. First is that NATO claims to be a regional organization, but is really expanding kind of beyond its legitimate scope. Second, that this is unjustified, unnecessary, really, because China is a force for world peace and doesn't merit exclusion for this or this kind of attention. And the third is that the prosperity and stability of the Asia-Pacific is at risk as NATO's foray into the Asia-Pacific will only certainly stir up tensions and animosities and really kind of continue to construct this kind of bloc confrontation, as they often say, this new Cold War paradigm or these old Cold War alliance structures. And last is that NATO is just simply, Beijing rejects that NATO is really is a party to any kind of the major security issues in the Indo-Pacific or Asia, not just Taiwan. But as you noted, the comment about North Korea that came from NATO, China rejected that entirely. The NATO just does not have a stake in that, or at least that's their claim. So NATO's communique this week says that the People's Republic of China's stated ambitions and coercive policies challenge our interests, security, and values, which will clearly drive China to unfold a number of initiatives to kind of counter this negative trajectory. This is going to be an intensifying competition between China and European interests in the Indo-Pacific, but particularly NATO's activities in the Indo-Pacific. And I'm sure, and maybe in the Q&A we can get into some details out of here more about this. But the bottom line is that China views this entire national strategy really is at risk And they have to act to counter this emerging bipolarity with China and Russia kind of being painted on one side and the collective West on the other. I don't think it's hyperbole, or at least it's arguable to say is the single most important thing that might have come out of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is actually this, and not other things that are manifesting in Europe. So, and I'll pause there.
Thank you. Apparently I don't have to remind people, if you have a question, please submit them. I've already got a bunch. And I also want to thank, as kind of the mid-panel commercial, thank our room sponsor, Oracle Cloud. Thank you, Oracle Cloud, our partners there. Andrew, Vilnius has been mentioned several times. Your office, you and your team have been working, I'm sure, for weeks and if not months in preparing this summit. Much of the daily, hourly coverage of it was about Ukraine. But I bet the secretaries and the president's target audience for a lot of the activity and discussion was many thousands of miles east in Beijing. So take us through bring us up to date now, viewpoints strategically from Europe, but also relevance from the Pacific for partnerships.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Lewis, for the introduction. I also want to thank AFCEA International and INSA for inviting me and us to all speak on this panel today. Our discussion today couldn't actually be timelier. As everybody knows, we just concluded a very successful NATO summit in Vilnius that focused on strengthening our Euro-Atlantic security, focused on support for Ukraine's sovereignty and self-defense, and also solidifying our Indo-Pacific partnerships. So I'll get into a little bit later to discussing the progress NATO has made with our Indo-Pacific partners since last year, but I'd also really like to give you first a DoD perspective on the results of the summit. Not this summit here, but the one in Vilnius. So I can't tell you how happy actually we are in Washington and in the Pentagon with the results of the summit. It provided an excellent opportunity to meet with our NATO allies at a critical time to discuss our collective security and bolster the alliance. It was also an opportunity to discuss support to Ukraine as it continues to defend its people and its territory. And perhaps the biggest news, as you all may have seen, is that Turkey's agreement to finally put Sweden's accession to its parliament for ratification. It's major news, and really it's a fantastic outcome from the summit. Now, you might have seen that there were a few twists and turns this week in that story. Nevertheless, I think that we have confidence in the U.S. government that Turkey will approve Sweden's accession and that Sweden will soon become NATO's 32nd member. Among the topics of discussion that was important was that NATO nations have now pledged to spend at least and even beyond 2% of GDP to ensure the alliance has the resource needs to meet our mutual defense needs. This commits alliance to spend 2% as a floor, not a ceiling, and this is an integral component of our shared commitment to security responsibilities. Allies also approved a Defense Production Action Plan, which will ensure long-term NATO engagement across the alliance to leverage the alliance's role in promoting sustainable defense industrial capacity, something we very much need to focus on after both COVID and the Ukraine war impacted our supply chains. And for the Department of Defense, a major success was securing a new generation of plans to improve our ability and our readiness to deter and defend against any threats in line with NATO's now 360-degree approach. So all in all, a very successful summit for NATO and for the United States. It took a great deal of hard work, maybe even a little bit more than usual on some things, but we're all quite pleased with the results. Turning to the Indo-Pacific and NATO, the topic of our panel here, please recall that last year at the Madrid summit, allies recognized the negative implications for the People's Republic of China's ambition for transatlantic security. The 2022 strategic concept from NATO asserted that the PRC's stated ambitions and coercive policies challenge our interests, challenge our security, and challenge our values. Additionally, China refused to denounce Putin's unjust, unprovoked, and unconscionable war, and actually continued to deepen its partnership with Russia even after February 2022. Contrast that with our Indo-Pacific partners, who joined in solidarity, and they stepped up in other ways by voting against Russia at the UN and adopting the tough sanctions that really helped to support Ukraine's democracy and sovereignty. Russia's revanchism and China's rise have made allies and partners see how security developments in the Indo-Pacific region directly affect Euro-Atlantic security and vice versa. Since Madrid, NATO has been focused on operationalizing all aspects of the strategic concept, including our commitment to strengthen cooperation with our partners in the Indo-Pacific region. And so this week, allies and partners gathered again at the Vilnius Summit to discuss resilience and the PRC challenge. In the summit declaration, allies identified cyber defense and technology, hybrid as shared security challenges that we will tackle with our Indo-Pacific partners. And among the key summit deliverables, we proudly announced NATO's individually tailored partnership programs for both Japan and the Republic of Korea. The partnership programs outline specific goals and objectives for NATO's partnerships with both countries. Japan's program agreement includes cooperation on cyber, cooperation on hybrid warfare, on arms control, on disinformation, on maritime security, and also in the space domain. Republic of Korea's program includes participating in NATO exercises, cooperation on cyber defense, women, peace and security, arms control, emerging technologies, and counterterrorism capabilities. So full agendas with both countries. And in addition, New Zealand reinforced its commitment to work on transnational challenges across the Atlantic and the Pacific. And we'll look forward to New Zealand renewing its formal partnership with NATO a little bit later this year. So much like our European allies have a vision for Europe at peace, Secretary of Defense Austin has also recognized that the Indo-Pacific countries are centered around a compelling vision, a free and open Indo-Pacific. And so it's important to see that our European allies are working more and more with our allies in the Indo-Pacific. And there's a lot of work in this space that's very exciting to see. Obviously, I think the crown jewel right now of cooperation between the United States, Europe, and the Indo-Pacific is the AUKUS arrangement, which will increase cooperation and capability development between the United States and the United Kingdom and Australia, and also to help deliver nuclear-powered submarines eventually to Australia as well. And our UK friends are also involved in another very interesting trilateral procurement undertaking with Italy and Japan to develop a new fighter jet. But there are other smaller, more operational, yet impactful contributions to security in the Indo-Pacific as well. France has, in recent years, sent fighter aircraft and ground forces to train in Japan. In fact, right now, French aircraft are training with the United States and Japan in the exercise Northern Edge in sites not only in Japan, but also in Guam. And Germany, our good friends and allies, sent the frigate Bayern to the Indo-Pacific in 2021, and in this month, we'll plan to have about 240 soldiers participate in exercise Talisman Sabre alongside the United States and Australia, actually in Australia. And it actually doesn't have to be Europeans going to the Indo-Pacific. And Australia actually proved that this week with its announcement that it's going to deploy an E-7 Wedgetail aircraft to Germany for 6 months to help protect multinational logistics hubs and ensure the uninterrupted flow of military and humanitarian aid into Ukraine. And these are just a few of the substantial ways and means that allies and partners are finding ways to work better together from the Atlantic and the Pacific. So in the face of a challenging security environment, we're seeing our European allies, we're seeing our Indo-Pacific partners working more closely together to increase defense, deter aggression, and contribute to international peace and stability. NATO, which is the most powerful and successful military alliance in history, is a great platform to bring our allies and Indo-Pacific partners closer together on security challenges. The alliance has successfully addressed a wide range of threats and challenges throughout its history, and so tackling the implications and developments in the Indo-Pacific region for Euro-Atlantic security will be, I think, a NATO priority for the coming decades. Thanks.
Thank you. That makes me think that something that Axel, I know, is holding in his lap was foreseen by an audience member who actually asked, yesterday Germany announced a new China strategy. We just had Andrew talking about different France and others and their activities in the Pacific. How did Germany come to develop a China policy? I think what's the bullet point version of the strategy and its relevance to exactly what we've been discussing?
Yes, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to elaborate on our security strategy on China, which came out yesterday, and maybe a short glance as well on the national security strategy, which came out 14th of June. So it seems that we are coming out every month with a strategy, but I haven't heard anything about August, so we will see.
We'll have another panel.
Yeah, but you never know when you get up in Washington in the morning. So the national, I start real in a quick glance with the national security strategy. This strategy is linked to the stability, or our security in Europe and in Germany is linked to stability in more distant regions of the world. So this is a quote in the national security strategy. We fully understood this, and therefore it is in our interest to advocate for the rules-based international order worldwide, including the Indo-Pacific region, on the basis of an inclusive approach with our partners for stability and security. This will include a balanced military presence in the Pacific region. And Andrew already mentioned the exercise Talisman Sabre. For us, it's the first time that we ever send, that Germany is sending a reinforced paratrooper company to an exercise, Talisman Sabre, starting 22nd of July, next Saturday, to the Indo-Pacific region. And you mentioned the frigate Bayern, and I sometimes have the feeling that everybody in the world knows our most famous frigate, Bayern, very proud old ship, 28 years old. But we have a relatively new class, that's a frigate 125 class, and we will send this ship next year on a tour around the world, starting in May and coming back in Germany in December, and doing an in-Pacific deployment again with an supply ship as well. So there will be next year 2 ships in the Indo-Pacific, and maybe some elements. We will monitor the compliance with UN sanctions against North Korea, led by Japan. This is the Pacific Security Maritime Exchange, and we will participate in the United States-led major maritime exercise RIMPAC, Rim of the Pacific. And we have bilateral cooperations with Canada, United States, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, India, France, and Israel in a sequence of chronology. In addition, the Air Force took part in the exercise Pitch Black and Kakadu with the Royal and Australian Air Force and the Royal Australian Navy last year. And on the way back, there was a split up of the force of the 6 Eurofighters in Singapore, and some of the Eurofighters visited Japan, and an A400M transport aircraft visited Korea. And the plan is, there is still a little bit of budget issue, but the plan is to participate in the exercise Pitch Black next year again, but we will see. But the Indo-Pacific deployment with the ship will come, and it will be a 125 frigate. So, and Andrew mentioned the procurement aspect. Our security strategy says about this, we will further develop our responsibility-based arms export policy. We have been very strict, very rigid on this, as you probably know, but we think we will have to seek cooperation with NATO that are maybe not the perfect partner for us. So even if they do not yet share all of our values, or if they do not share our model of society, Even among such actors, we think there are many who are interested in maintaining the rules-based international order. And in this context, we must be able to offer cooperation, especially so that these countries are not forced to follow offers from those who are challenging the international order. And in this regard, in particular, again, responsibility-based arms export policy requires us to strengthen partner countries in their right of self-defense. So, but coming to your original question about the China strategy.
Quickly, yes.
Real quick, yeah. And so one or two major sentences. China has changed. We realized this in Germany. And as a result of this, China's political decisions, we need to change our approach to China in Germany. And we will do this. For Germany, China remains a partner, a competitor, and a systematic rival. That's not new, but we have to see that the elements of rivalry and competition have increased in recent years, and therefore we have to react. I can talk now for hours, but I think I stop over here.
Thank you. Andrew, you had a quick reaction?
Yeah, just a really quick thing. Germany's China strategy, which I've just gotten into this morning, it looks really good from the onset, and I think some of the press lines from it are really good and really focus on how all of us really need to make sure that our supply chains are secure, and we need to, there's a discussion about de-risking our supply chains. But it is one of the latest ways that our European allies have been looking at the Indo-Pacific and at China. In the last 2 years, Lithuania, the Netherlands, France, Italy, and the EU have all come up with Indo-Pacific strategies. And the UK, even though they don't have their own strategy on the Indo-Pacific, in their integrated review, which is almost like an ND, a national defense strategy, talked about their Indo-Pacific tilt. So we're seeing this a lot more just in the last couple of years, where our European allies are actually putting a lot of strategic focus on the Indo-Pacific as well, which is great to see.
So, Charlie, this sounds like the living embodiment of what we've been talking about for more than a decade, a pivot to Asia. Where do we stand now, though? What's the correlation of forces, if you will? This is a dynamic moment. All along, China's been developing their own thinking, their own strategy, their own military development.
Well, it's about time. That's the short answer, that our attention's been riveted, our resources are driving it. As we just heard, Germany is beginning to think about this, and policy, strategy, and resources will flow. But let's be very clear that we are all in a game of catch-up at this point, which is why there's such a sense of urgency across the board. I know there was a panel earlier today on China. If we want to count things, things that can be counted, you don't have to look very far to understand why the stakes have gone up, why the threat has gone up. Not only the words that are coming out of Beijing, but their production lines and their work to monopolize a fair amount of the industries that are going to dominate the 21st century. So again, the pivot is coming, and the pivot is coming under incredible circumstances, as we've heard, in the midst of a war in Europe. That's good. That should not let us off the hook, that this needs to be accelerated about as quickly as we possibly can, because every time I hear numbers about whether or not NATO allies or Asia Pacific allies are going to counted as good or bad ally of the United States, as predicated upon whether or not they've hit a 2% number, that's the wrong metric to use. It's an easy one because we can point to it, but that assumes that our adversary is going to hold stable of what they are doing too. I mean, this is a net assessment point about how quickly we are moving against the challenge that we all face. So again, I'm not knocking the 2%, but again, this needs to be taken in relation to how quickly not only China, but China and Russia are advancing their military instrument.
Colleen, counting things and understanding competitive assessments, that's the province of intelligence. But there's also the positive side that we've seen of intelligence among allies, and that's information sharing and intelligence sharing. So what's the tactical reality of our relationships among traditional partners and NATO partners for the Pacific?
So I can't answer that, or I would have to kill you. No, I'm kidding. No, of course. We are seeing an amazing increase in the number of partners that are willing to have a conversation about the kind of threats that China and its military modernization and and its reach into cornering the market on global resources and in some cases causes. And so I mentioned earlier that many of our traditional partnerships are really bilateral in the Pacific region. That is changing on a daily basis. We are seeing more and more fora develop where we have multilateral partnerships. Some of the partnerships that we've previously had that have been issue focused are being driven by our partners to include the issue of how do we jointly compete with China. And competition with China, let's be clear, is not necessarily beating them in hand-to-hand combat. Competition with China is winning hearts and minds and developing new opportunities for other partners. And so that means that we have to compete with them across a space that is not necessarily confined to the military and diplomatic space, but in the economic space as well. And so we are seeing all of our partners recognize that and lean forward in ways that are really incredibly helpful. So the German strategy that was just published, their recent deployments into the region, all of that from a military perspective is heartening. But the fact that the German strategy is not limited to a military strategy is, I think, what is going to actually put us in a position to compete effectively. The more that we see partnerships that are available to our Pacific partners that begin to establish this new globalized perspective, the more that we'll see progress being made that not necessarily shuts China out, but ratchets them back to a degree where others can flourish in that environment as well.
I have a question. I'm going to use it to pose unfortunately, the final question and give it to Chad. The question is actually, this is not the one I want you to answer necessarily, but the question is there a date past which China would be able to overcome Taiwan, U.S. allied defenses and take the island? The way I would rather have the session end is, Chad, a succinct description of what is it that NATO and our alliance partners could do so that that decision is made in Beijing, not today. How do we keep that decision made tomorrow, the next day, 5 years from now, not today? It's the most important deterrent thing.
Yeah, to answer that question is a little bit of an explanation of what we already kind of discussed, which was, the Chinese or the party is going to always want to try to obviously kind of isolate any problems that it has, and in this case, across strait scenarios, is to try to limit the implications and the negative aspects of any kind of, in this case, military coercive action, to minimize the impact on its long-term national aspirations. And so, Taiwan's own self-defense capacity is a problem. Certainly, any U.S. intervention is something that the Chinese are designing specific warfighting constructs and capabilities to deny. And then any other kind of regional power that invests potentially in that kind of intervention is just a problem for China. But you can see in China's writings is that the one that seems to be most powerful is any kind of European, and in this case, really kind of under the NATO framework, NATO intervention alongside with the United States and other regional powers is a really significant problem. And not just because of the military component that NATO brings, but really as it drags in all the other organs of power that would be reflected by NATO's intervention, so economic and diplomatic isolation, and not even in the near term, really it's the long-term ramifications of any kind of protracted contest here that would isolate China and really off-track it pretty significantly from getting towards its end state. So this is, in this way, as NATO becomes, NATO's participation in activities in the Indo-Pacific, and really globally, right? Because this is a global issue. It's not really just an Indo-Pacific issue to contest China. It's symbolic of a broader turn that China is really dependent upon not occurring. And so as a reflection of that, as a symbolic act, that is a really significant problem for China, that China is going to be very active here over the next few years, really trying to contest and counter, to provide arguments back to the European Union and back to the NATO countries about why this is not in their interest, to try to suppress these activities that have generated this turn or this change of condition, and kind of get it hopefully back to a place that's more viable for China's long-term aspirations. But this is a significant issue, and I'll raise a couple issues, and one prominently that the Chinese will certainly bend on, which is, and maybe a caution for us and certainly for Andrew's team, is that NATO's participation in Asia, the Chinese are really going to portray that as an outsider organization trying to invest itself in Asia security issues that many Asians themselves don't favor. And that means that it's not enough to just partner with Japan, Korea, and Australia, and the Kiwis, but to figure out these other multinational organizations that are there and partner with them, because there's legacy animosities here that are at stake, and you're going to have to kind of figure out how to get past those, to get collaboration at that level, because the Chinese will leverage that animosity here. So that's not undoable. But recognize the Chinese are really going to probably poke on that quite a bit, and there will be some effectiveness to that, potentially.
Well, I feel marginally more optimistic, I think, based on the whole discussion. I want to, for a discussion that easily could go on for another hour, I want to have you join me in thanking our panelists for this. We'll have to get the gang back together again to do this again and chart further progress. Right now we're heading into a break, a networking and exhibit break down in the main atrium downstairs, and further session with a keynote from National Security Advisor, Principal Deputy Director John Feiner after that. Thank you very much.